Hey there, CATLICK fans. BT here. First off, thanks for listening. Super glad you're here. Second, this episode begins with one of the most violent and graphic parts of our story yet. So just kind of giving you a heads up. If you want to opt out, feel free to skip forward a few minutes and you should be good. Cheers. By late November, autumn had fully settled in Atlanta. The last colors of fall clung to the trees around the South's lively railroad town. The morning of Tuesday, November 21st, was a chilly one, about 40 degrees. Thanksgiving Day was about a week away. At the Atlanta Police Headquarters that morning, we know that Police Captain Mayo and Acting Police Chief Starnes were on duty. On this sleepy Tuesday, the officers sipped their coffee as they scanned the day's headlines. The Constitution ran a front-page story about a big rally happening later that night in downtown Atlanta. The featured guest would be Joe Brown, the guy running for governor. They didn't know it, but their morning was about to take a dramatic turn. Around 8 a.m., a call came into the precinct. An older black woman was on the other end of the line. She was obviously disturbed. Through a shaking voice, she explained that her two children discovered a horrific scene near their home, near Stewart Avenue. Mayo and Starnes grabbed their jackets and raced out the back door of the police station. They fired up two of APD's shiny new Pope motorbikes and bolted out of the parking lot, heading west. When the officers arrived, they were led to an embankment abutting the West Point rail line. One of the children pointed down towards a gully running at the base of the embankment. The officers noted a trail of blood and disturbances in the soil, implicating that something or someone had been killed at the top of the embankment and then dragged down to the gully. As the officers traversed the steep decline, they could make out what appeared to be a shallow grave. In the center of the grave was a large form topped by several old flour sacks and scattered with red Georgia clay. Captain Mayo took a deep breath, bent down, and pulled back the flour sacks. The men recoiled at one of the most grisly sights either of them had ever seen: the butchered remains of a young black woman. Her throat had been slashed, and her face had been beaten so badly her teeth had fallen out. But her killer didn't stop there. The Georgian explains. There were two long slashes done with either a knife or a razor. One gash extended downward, the full length of the trunk, from the throat down over the abdomen. The other gash extended across the abdomen from side to side, the two gashes being at right angles. After carving open her torso, the killer removed her internal organs. She was disemboweled. And in one final, bizarre, and depraved act, the woman's killer cut out her heart and carefully placed it beside her mangled body. One of the newspapers would later say of the murder scene, quote, "A more atrocious murder has never come to light in the history of the city," end quote. The paper noted that when the men inspected the remains on that chilly November morning, the body was still warm, which meant that the crime had only been committed a few hours earlier. Perhaps the killer was nearby. They had to move quickly. The men called in additional detectives as well as a team of bloodhounds. Upon arrival, the dogs seized on a scent and charged forward, sniffing, panting, and barking, with eager officers in tow. The team of dogs raced through a field in the direction of a popular trolley line. The men followed the hounds for 200 yards, eventually arriving at the Stewart Avenue trolley station. But, just like that, the frenzy of the dogs died down. The winded men caught their breath, and the scent was lost. This convinced police that the killer made his escape by boarding the first trolley car that morning. The paper goes on to note that shortly after, word began to spread in the African-American community and, like before, a crowd began to gather near the scene of the crime. But that's not all. The Georgian. Several theories are advanced by the police as to the fiendish murderer, but the prevailing opinion is that he is a fanatic of some kind, or the agent of some organized society. The agent of some organized society? And the article ends with another equally cryptic statement. This is a direct quote from Captain Mayo, who was there that morning. "I am satisfied this murderer is a fanatic, incited to murder through some weird belief." Some weird belief? An organized society? Where is this coming from? You're listening to episode 6 of CATLICK, Black or White. Heading up to the rooftop. Here we go. So I'm now on the rooftop, once again, of the building where I live. It's in sort of east of downtown Atlanta, a little place called Cabbagetown. It's about 10 p.m. And I'm standing on top of the old Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill, which I think I mentioned earlier. It's an old cotton mill that they turned into lofts and apartments back, but it's a great big red building. It's about 135 years old. There's behind me these big smokestacks, and they're all lit up. The developer basically put like a big spotlight on them. Directly beneath me, kind of looking out towards the city skyline, running east-west, there's a train line. That thing's been there since about the Civil War. And then just above the train line is MARTA, which is kind of like our subway public transit system. Just beyond that, to the north, that's Old Fourth Ward, so that's kind of Dr. King's neighborhood. Really, really historic place. Awesome. Beyond that, it's the Atlanta skyline. Looks amazing at night, all lit up. It's pretty cool. And then when you look west, sort of in the distance, you can see the gold dome of the Georgia State Capitol building. Kind of a little bit before that, you can see just barely Grady Hospital, which is kind of known around Atlanta for like treating gunshot wounds, trauma, that kind of thing. But usually when you stand up here during the day or at night, you can see helicopters kind of coming in and out, taking patients to Grady. And then behind me to the south, and you can't see it, but it's, I don't know, maybe 10 or 20 miles is the Atlanta airport. Of course, that's known as the busiest airport in the world. And it's kind of cool up here at night. You can see all the planes sort of heading into the airport, and usually I think I can count 7 right now heading that way. So I think I've counted like 15. I think that's the most I've ever seen, but there's always a ton of planes heading that direction. And then sort of when I turn to my right, I look east and I can barely see sort of the entrance to Krog Tunnel, which I've talked about. It's kind of one of the areas where several Ripper victims were found. And then if you look really far east, you can barely make it out at night, but it's kind of this like shadowy hump far in the distance. I don't know, maybe 30 miles away. But that's Stone Mountain, and it's just this gigantic sort of weird hump of granite. It looks like a big turtle shell. But that's where the KKK started, the second one. So the first KKK pretty much got started right around the end of the Civil War in Tennessee, but it kind of fizzled out. The U.S. government cracked down, and yeah, it just kind of died. But the second version of the KKK started in Georgia over 100 years ago. So it's wild. Like when you read stories back then of like people who lived around the base of Stone Mountain, they would look up in the middle of the night and see, like a giant cross burning on the top of Stone Mountain. And that's kind of how you knew the Klan was having a big rally. So kind of spooky. But so yeah, this is like one of my favorite views of the city. It's really pretty at night, but it's also sort of like prime Ripper territory. Like I can see a couple locations where bodies were found, again over near Krog, and then of course there was like another cluster kind of to the west of here. So that's one of the weird things about big cities is, man, you're surrounded by all kind of history. Most people never know the stuff that went down, but a lot of stuff went down. Always a mystery, always interesting. All right, I'm out. So, here we are, month number 11 of our story, November 1911. Since January, 13 young black women have been killed in a similar, brutal way. Henry Huff, the African-American man accused of killing Sadie Holly back in the summer, is still behind bars, awaiting trial for her murder and also suspected of being the Ripper. Now, back on that gruesome morning, November 21st, the horribly mutilated body of victim number 14 was discovered. Papers would later identify her as Mary Putnam. Now, this is certainly the most hair-raising murder we've encountered yet, but there are so many questions based off these news reports, it's tough to even know where to begin. First, the article said that the two kids discovered the body on that Tuesday morning. It's a bit odd to me that two kids are out on a freezing November morning alone and they just happen to stumble upon a murder scene that's just a couple hours old. Second, I've checked the lunar records for that night, November 20th. It was a new moon, which meant it was the precise day of the month when there was no moon visible and therefore no moonlight. The Georgian also reported that all this happened in a rural area. I'm not sure it would even be possible to do this kind of like weird surgical work in the pitch dark, disemboweling and removing a heart. And did the killer kill on this particular night because he knew it would be extra dark? I don't know. Also, why did the killer attempt to cover up or bury the body? He'd never done that before. And where did these flour sacks come from? Furthermore, the article noted that the dirt on top of the body looked like the killer had dug it out of the embankment with his hands. So this person brutally disembowels a woman and then starts digging in the dirt with his hands. How could he have casually boarded this morning trolley? When the other passengers have noticed a guy covered head to toe in blood and mud, it just doesn't seem possible, yet the police were convinced of their trolley theory. And finally, you've got these mentions of an organized society and the motive of some weird belief. This is the first time the police had alluded to anything like this. And at this point, we have no idea what they're basing this theory on. Like I said, lots of questions. Though the black community in Atlanta had already been working overtime, this latest murder sparked a new flurry of activity from its leaders. Only this time, their plans get a whole lot more urgent. The week after the murder of Mary Putnam, there were two mass meetings held. The first one took place at Big Bethel Church. Similar to Wheat Street Baptist, Big Bethel is another fabled African-American congregation in Atlanta. Today, if you drive through downtown Atlanta on Interstate 85, you can't miss Big Bethel. It sort of sits in the foreground with the skyline behind it. The gray stone church has a large tower bearing 10 enormous blue illuminated letters that spell out, Jesus Saves. After Mary Putnam's death, Reverend Jackson McHenry presided at that meeting at Big Bethel. McHenry spent much of his life advocating for the black community. I discovered an incredible quote by him that I think sheds some light on that meeting. Here it is. Again, this is Jackson McHenry telling a story about black activism. A white man once had a colored man in a buggy beside him driving. The colored man was skillful with the whip. He could take his whip and pick a fly off a rose. As he drove along, whenever he saw a fly on a rose or a bush, he would take his whip and just pick him off. Finally, he came to a hornet's nest. The white man said, "Jim, there is a chance to show your skill. Why not pick that fellow off the hornet's nest?" Jim said, "No, sir, boss. They's organized." And that is what the black man has got to do. Organize to protect himself and his family. One more time. That is what the black man has got to do. Organize to protect himself and his family. Though he said this in 1919, this idea must have been on his mind at this big meeting of black leaders in November 1911. The Hornets were gathered, and they were ready to strike. The papers reported on that meeting. Headline: Negroes will protect women of their race. There were a few big decisions that came out of that meeting. First, on the next Sunday, every black preacher was to warn their congregations to be vigilant and on the lookout for the Ripper. But then, they took it a step further. Every minister was also tasked with taking the message outside the church walls and canvassing the communities with the warning as well. Then finally, and most dramatically, they announced that all Negro women were to stay off the streets after dark, a self-imposed, community-wide curfew. Now, this was a hell of a mandate with big financial ramifications. This meant lots of women couldn't go to their service jobs in the homes of wealthy white Atlantans. Again, a reminder of just how seriously these leaders were taking this. Honestly, I think this is awesome. Here you have these men activating, mobilizing, and getting creative with their communication in a pre-TV, pre-radio era. They knew their most powerful communication platform was the Sunday morning pulpit. So they tap into Atlanta's network of black churches, deputize the pastors as their spokesman, and then impose a curfew. Their final act that day was to pass the plate and collect an offering for a reward. $1,200 was raised. 2 days later, a second mass meeting was held, this time at Hugh Proctor's First Congregational. The leaders at this meeting drafted a lengthy list of resolutions making various appeals to, quote, the forces that shape public opinion in this community. Here's an excerpt from what they drafted. The race and character of these women may be a matter of interest, but these do not affect the main proposition of the necessity for the protection of human life as a prime need in the community. Whether he views from the standpoint of the disturbance of domestic labor, the outraged majesty of the law, or the deadening of the common conscience of the community, the wholesale slaughter of these women must be a matter of deep concern to every person in this city. Did you catch that? The, quote, disturbance of domestic labor? Here's my summary. Women are dying, and that should bother everybody here. You should care. We don't even mind if the only reason you care is because your maid isn't showing up for work anymore. Just please care. I think this is one of those moments where it's good to pause and just consider how insanely tragic this whole thing is. Deep down, these men know that most of the powerful people in Atlanta are mostly unmoved by the deaths of these black women. Instead of being appropriately outraged at the injustice of this, they published this super dignified and eloquent appeal, kindly asking the city to embrace the idea that the lives of all Atlantans, both black and white, are sacred. They continue with their resolutions. They appeal to the local black community, encouraging them to cooperate with police. They appeal to local law enforcement, asking them to step up their investigations. They appeal to the press to keep putting the focus on the victims in the open cases. And they make other appeals to the schools, to the churches, to the homemakers. You can read the full resolution inside the vault. It's pretty fascinating. But perhaps the most interesting line in the resolution is this one. Inasmuch as the present detectives have been unable to bring results, we appeal to the legal authorities to employ color detectives in these cases, as they may have certain advantages over white detectives. Now, if you remember, this isn't the first time they've asked for black detectives. They've been asking for this for months now, but they keep getting denied. But this makes me wonder, why would black detectives have certain advantages over white detectives? Well, I think to know the answer to that, I need to tell you more about the investigation into the murder of this latest Ripper victim, Mary Putnam. The day after Mary's body was found, the paper reported that 2 black men were arrested on suspicion of killing her. The first, Walter Putnam, who they identified as Mary's stepson. The other was a 70-year-old man named Elmore Grant, who Mary lived with. At least one reporter in the city found it funny that a 70-year-old man had been arrested as the Ripper. Headline: Tottering Negro held for murder of woman. Opening paragraph: An old man who has passed his 70 year, who can hardly shuffle along, is held as a suspect in the murder of Mary Putnam. Did you catch the sarcasm? The article mentions that Walter, her stepson, was also arrested and, quote, there is no direct evidence against either, end quote. So, 2 guys arrested, no direct evidence. But the police didn't stop there. A few days later, the Georgian reports that police arrested Mary's husband for her murder as well. But get this, the guy didn't even live in Atlanta. He lived in a little town called Cordell, 140 miles south. The article says, Mr. Putnam was brought to Atlanta from Cordell by Detective George Bullard. Are you following? Atlanta police sent an officer 140 miles south to arrest Mary's husband and bring him back to Atlanta. They've now arrested Mary's stepson, housemate, and husband. All men, all black. And the papers haven't reported one shred of evidence against any of them. On November 24th, the dragnet expands. The Georgian reports that police arrested another man, this guy named Bud Wise. If you remember victim number 13, her name was Minnie Wise, so Bud is her husband. It's reported that police are operating under the theory that there is no single Ripper. Then, the cards come out from the Georgian. Working on this theory, they arrested Wise and believe they will be able to convict him before a jury. Do you see what's happening? It's just a big, random roundup. This is the natural byproduct of recorder Broyles' belief that black men all over the city are just slashing and killing their wives, girlfriends, and mistresses. And the police are just arresting any man remotely connected to these women. Once word of all these arrests began to spread, can you imagine the chilling effect it must have had on the black community? The formula for black men was consistent. Get questioned by police, get arrested by police. So I think this is what the black leaders were referring to when they said that black detectives would, quote, have certain advantages over white detectives. If this killer was black, and if he was living and working in the black community, the number one asset for police would be members of the black community to report shady characters in their midst. Of course, that's impossible when you're arresting black men with no evidence, because the black men just stopped talking. Think about it. If you knew something, would you go waltzing into police headquarters knowing you were just putting yourself under the microscope? Hell no. And this is where I think it's worth pausing to question a basic assumption of the police: that the killer was black. Remember, the notion that the killer was black came from 2 sources. The first was Emma Lou Sharp, the young woman who went looking for her mom when she didn't return from the market. According to Emma Lou, a guy emerged from the shadows, and when she turned to run, he stabbed her in the back. She told police her attacker was a tall black man with a wide-brimmed hat. The second witness was Mary Yeldell, who encountered a man whistling at the end of an alley. He chased her, she got away. Apparently, she described him as a tall black man as well. Among 13 victims, we have these 2 first-hand accounts. The only problem is, we don't know if these women encountered the same guy. We don't know if he was, in fact, the Ripper. And we don't know the circumstances under which these women gave these eyewitness reports. Were they under duress? Were they coerced to describe the man in a certain way? Honestly, nothing would surprise me. Back then, the people with the guns and the typewriters got to form the narrative. And based off these 2 reports, they all believed that the Ripper was a black man. But what if the people in power were wrong? What if the Ripper wasn't black? The idea that the Atlanta Ripper wasn't, in fact, black isn't a new one. It's over 100 years old, to be exact. Surprisingly, it was proposed in 1911 by someone 2,600 miles away from Atlanta. The Seattle Republican was a successful African-American newspaper in the early 20th century. Horace Caton Sr. was its founder. Horace was born as a slave in Mississippi in 1859. Later in life, he moved to Seattle, where he became a reporter for a larger paper and eventually started his own African-American newspaper called the Seattle Republican. His paper covered the local African-American community in Seattle, but they also weighed in on national news stories that would come in from the East Coast papers. Well, at some point in 1911, the Seattle Republican offered a theory on all the Ripper reports coming out of Atlanta. It's a short article, but it begins with the basis for the theory, a commentary based off the story of Marielle Dell. Once again, she's the one who was walking home from work. She hears a guy whistling at the end of a dark alley. The guy comes after her. She gets away. She then runs back to the home of the white family she worked for. The patriarch of the family grabs his gun, runs to the alley, and he's shocked to find the guy still standing there. Mysteriously, the shadowy figure gets away and somehow escapes into the night. So, here's what the Seattle Republican had to say about that story. Ripping Jack is no Negro at all, but a white man in disguise, and gave the man with the pistol in his hands the high sign, which explains why he did not shoot the wretch. The average white man never loses an opportunity to shoot a black man, if he has the slightest excuse for doing so, and under the circumstances which he met Jack, no power could have saved the black man from getting the entire contents of the white man's revolver, unless he was given the high sign in time to refrain from the shooting. Mark these words, that Jack the Ripper is a white man regulating the streets of Atlanta by keeping the black women off the streets. So, the theory is that when the white guy raised his gun to shoot the man at the end of the dark alley, the man responded with some kind of universally recognized white person hand signal. And once he saw that, he was like, "Oh, you're cool." And he lowered his gun. Let's talk about this theory. It's not that far-fetched that the Ripper could have been a white man in blackface. From minstrel shows in the 1800s to the early years of the film industry, in the 1900s, it's well documented that white people painted themselves black to portray black people. It happened a lot. And if I was some kind of early 20th century psychopath, donning blackface would be a pretty solid strategy to avoid getting caught. Add in an oversized hat and a moonless night, and I think people would have a pretty hard time noticing that your blackness was painted on. Furthermore, we know that several modern-day serial killers wore disguises or masks. In an interview with A&E, Dr. Carol Lieberman, a forensic psychiatrist, said this, quote, "When killers wear masks or costumes to relive the crime, it's paradoxical. It's a way of distancing themselves from the evil person who committed the crime, while at the same time making the connection with their fantasy or delusion more intimate." End quote. So yeah, I can see some deranged white guy taking on the persona of a black killer and heading out into the streets in blackface. And from the slavery era, we also know the disgusting history of white men committing acts of rape and violence against black women. Perhaps now, 50-ish years after slavery, there was some sick person with fantasies of violence against black women. It's not a ridiculous theory. This theory, though, likely never crossed the minds of the Atlanta police, as many still thought they had the Ripper already caught. In November, Henry Huff was still being held for the murder of Sadie Holly, and his trial was finally underway. The day before Thanksgiving, the Constitution reported on the trial. Jack the Ripper again has center of stage. The article begins by pointing out that 7 women have died since Huff was arrested. Apparently, the prosecution proved that Huff was, in fact, in that cab with Sadie the night she died. But then, their case fell apart. It was thought that the state had a pretty clear case against Huff, but the Negro's attorneys, Tuesday, succeeded in accounting for the blood upon the Negro's clothes. Their witnesses offered an alibi, and in addition, a number of reputable white businessmen of Atlanta testified to Huff's good character. Sure enough, the next day the paper reported on the outcome of Huff's trial. Alleged Ripper free, proved his innocence. After several months, Henry Huff was finally off the hook. The paper noted the current bleak state of the investigation. This means that the police department and the county authorities are as far as ever from a solution to the Jack the Ripper murders. So yeah, we're 14 victims in, and the police, they got nothing. Thanksgiving comes and goes, and December brings lots of holiday cheer to the Atlanta newspapers. Local merchants take out daily ads, hoping to entice shoppers to get their Christmas shopping done early. The Constitution celebrates the festive holiday season by running a huge, full-page story about the current crime wave haunting Atlanta. It calls such a crime wave a, quote, spasmodic outbreak. Then it reviews some of the criminal highlights of 1911. 2 guys who attempted to blow open some safes with dynamite, some bandits getting into a shootout with the owner of a drugstore, and it tells the story of a black purse snatcher named John Galt. It follows with a super racist observation about Galt. Here it is. This Negro's skull would be a splendid specimen for anthropologists. Heavy and coarse and low, it lacks any sign of intelligence. And finally, the article mentions the Ripper murders, calling them the most remarkable series of murders the city has ever known. It says these murders have been spreading terror to the Negro sections, causing meetings, and leaving many a white family without its cook at night. Here we go again, associating this horrible killing spree with inconvenienced white people. It's kind of exhausting. And sure enough, just a few days after this article, the Ripper strikes again, the final murder of 1911. On December the 8th, the papers reported an attack on Zella Favors, a young African-American woman who lived near Taylor Street. Surprisingly, her body was found on the front porch of a house. Her head had been badly crushed, and she had multiple knife wounds to her face and body. She was still breathing when they found her, and they rushed her to Grady Hospital in critical condition. Detectives traced a trail of blood from the front porch to a nearby spot on Pratt Street. The woman may have been attacked and then dragged to the porch, or perhaps she stumbled there and collapsed after she was attacked. We really don't know. Now, this assault was a bit unusual in that it did not occur in a rural area. There were homes around. So is this the Ripper changing tactics? Is he getting lazy or sloppy or just more deranged? Time would tell. On Christmas Day, the Atlanta newspapers wished their readers lots of holiday cheer, alongside their usual dosage of weird. There was an article about King George's recent hunting trip to India, triumphantly noting that he bagged a stag, 3 rhinos, and 18 tigers. There was a half-page ad for Lewis 66 whiskey. It's Christmas Day, go figure. And there was an article featuring some fiery language from a local white minister named Dr. Broughton. Dr. Broughton presided over the Baptist Tabernacle Church in downtown Atlanta. They just opened a brand new sanctuary at the end of 1911. Dr. Broughton was one of many ministers in the city, constantly chastising Atlanta for its drunken ways. On Christmas Eve, Dr. Broughton gave a passionate sermon praising Recorder Broyles for his hard stance against the saloons and encouraging city leaders to give him even more power. He reminds his congregation that the church's official position on alcohol is total prohibition. Now, this is a bit ironic because Broughton's church still stands today, only now it's a really cool concert venue simply called The Tabernacle. And we'll just say prohibition ain't exactly alive and well there today. Broughton ended his sermon that day with a strong warning. And for context, when he says the word Tigerites, that's sort of a slang expression for moonshiners. Here's Dr. Broughton. I put you on notice, you Tigerites, that next year with the police judge giving 12-month sentences, you had better take to the tall timbers. For as your friend, I warn you that hard times are ahead for you. Then, I want to go even one step further, and that is, close up all the social clubs, which are nothing but saloons. I fail to see where the social is unless it be to get drunk together and lie down together. Pretty strong words. Now, Dr. Broughton's final warning there was a pretty severe one, threatening to shut down the social clubs of Atlanta. The Atlanta social clubs wielded a lot of power in the city. Their memberships included all the movers and shakers, both men and women. The top two most influential were founded in the 1880s, the Capital City Club and the Gentlemen's Driving Club. The members of these clubs were, as you would expect, super rich and, of course, all white. But the exclusion didn't end there. They also were predominantly Christian, which basically just meant no Jews allowed. In addition to being pretty racist, Atlanta was also really anti-Semitic back then. As a response to these exclusive clubs, Atlanta's Jewish community started a few clubs of their own. Arguably the most elite was the Standard Club. Clubs like this were created as a way for the Jewish community to establish their own high society in Atlanta. Stephen Hertzberg has a great book on the history of the Jewish community in Atlanta called Strangers in the Gate City. He notes that the Standard Club had a downtown mansion as their headquarters and that it provided, quote, facilities for poker, bridge, dancing, and bowling. Dues were high, and membership was limited to 150. End quote. So this is the sinful foolishness Broughton was talking about in that Christmas Eve service. Well, in late 1911, the Georgian publishes an article about a grand ball hosted by the Standard Club. It describes an elaborate dance, charming debutantes, huge floral arrangements of red roses, and a decadent dinner. The article opines about the beautiful gowns worn by the women. Chiffon over blue satin, white satin and point lace, yellow satin veiled and spangled marquisette, and most extravagantly, a Paris toilette of white charmeuse satin made with long court train and embroidered with butterflies. I have no idea what that is, but sounds very fancy. Needless to say, this was a classy affair. And in attendance were several members of the Elsis family. This was one of the most well-known Jewish names in all Atlanta. The women in attendance were named in context of their husbands. Ms. Victor Elsis, Ms. Ben Elsis, Ms. Oscar Elsis, and Ms. Lewis Elsis. The Elsises were extremely wealthy and very well connected. And though they danced the night away at this elegant soiree, all was not well in the Elsis enterprise. Trouble was brewing, but it would be a while before any of them knew. Atlanta's holiday celebrations may have distracted the city from the horrors that had unfolded that year. There were now 15 victims of an unknown killer. Henry Huff was a free man. Police were making veiled comments about an organized society, yet they were no closer to catching the killer than they'd been since Rosa Trice first died in Pittsburgh way back in January. At the end of December, 1911 came to a quiet close in Atlanta. But the calm wouldn't last for long. The Ripper would waste little time in the new year. And when he reemerges, he decides to trade his knife for a pen. That's next time on CATLICK. CATLICK is recorded in Atlanta's historic Cabbagetown neighborhood. Executive producer, Walnut Ridge Harmon. Original music and sound design by Duciel. Cover art by Rachel Eleanor. Don't forget to check CATLICK.com for apparel and merchandise inspired by the CATLICK era. And of course, while you're there, you can sign up for the ultimate CATLICK upgrade, The Vault. We've got a whole batch of fascinating photos, maps, and news clippings just for this episode. It's all waiting for you at CATLICK.com/vault. That's CATLICK.com/vault. CATLICK is independently written and produced by me, B.T. Harmon. And I'd like to remind you to save old buildings, build bike lanes, and vote for public transit. We'll see you in the next episode.